Hide and seek is fun, until you realize there's one more player than what you started with, and they're not human or at all normal. Today I've got some stories about living in or next to the woods, and why that's sometimes a very scary place to be. Enjoy these allegedly true scary stories, and be sure to send me your stories for a narration at darkstories.org. I'd love to hear possible modern dinosaur sightings, strange creatures seen in China, or stories about the scariest things that happened to you while trying to sleep. Also, be sure to follow and listen to all my podcasts at eeriecast.com. Now, let's begin. Walkie-talkie in the woods, from Jack36. I recall a time back in the days when I was a kid. It may not have been the scariest experience I've had, but it certainly was bizarre in nature and makes me seriously question reality. Since I've become an adult, I haven't been hiking or exploring nearly as often, for pretty obvious reasons. Having a job, tending to family, etc. I still try to go out every once in a while, and when I do, it brings back so much nostalgia. I've tried my best not to think about the bad experiences I've had out in the woods, but sometimes I can't help myself. Just a few days ago, when I was driving to get groceries, I went through a tunnel, and that's when my radio cut out. You know the typical static you get when the broadcasting service isn't available, right? Well, there it was, as clear as ever, as I went through that tunnel. It gave me goosebumps. I'd never been one for that sound to begin with, but it only made it worse as I encountered a flashback so vivid, back to when I was only 10 years old. This is where the real story begins. It was your typical weekend afternoon, and I was with my friend Joe. We'd been lifelong buddies to that point in time, and we still continue to talk every now and then to this day. It was fall. The leaves were in the process of changing color. It looked beautiful outside. We were in my backyard admiring the forest that backed into my family's property. There was a vast amount of forest to explore back there, and we hadn't been through all of it just yet. We had been obsessed with becoming army men back then, and we had the whole setup: walkie-talkies, tactical pocket knives, camo backpacks, airsoft pistols, and things of that nature. At one point, Joe interrupted the conversation we were having about my grade school crush. He said to me, "Hey, want to go play army guys in the forest?" I grudgingly agreed, but at the same time I knew playing army guys would be a lot of fun. Basically, it was just tactical hide and seek, but with our wild imaginations, it was so much more. Joe said he'd try to capture me first, and I agreed. So I ran a good amount into the forest and found a tree to climb up on. Nature sounds consumed me. It was so calming outside. I then turned my walkie-talkie on and waited for him to call in, to let me know he was on his way to find me. I sat there for a while. Before long, I spotted a deer eating berries from a bush not too far off. It hadn't noticed me yet, so I sat there admiring it. Suddenly, my walkie-talkie started giving off major amounts of static. Something had happened. I knew I hadn't switched to any other channel, and that I remained on the one with my friend. But even so, high-pitched sounds began to emanate from the walkie-talkie. I saw the deer perk up, then run away. I was completely alone then. I was frightened then, and I wasn't exactly sure of what to do. Goosebumps consumed my body. I was frozen in fear as the static slowly subsided, giving way to some sort of demonic howl. It lasted about 3 seconds, then all was silent. All of the wood's sounds were dead. I heard absolutely nothing after that. I knew something was wrong, and I knew I had to get out of there. The static had gone too. It seemed to have happened all at once. I turned off the walkie-talkie, jumped off the tree, and made a run for it back to my house. Joe was waiting for me there, a look of concern on his face. My parents were outside, visibly hysterical, phone in hand. They had called the police to send someone over to help locate me. As I ran out of the tree line towards them, my parents ran up to hug me. I was scared and confused. My parents asked me how I got so lost in the forest. I sat there puzzled, not knowing how to respond to that. All I could say was, I don't know. I was apparently gone for 2 hours. Joe kept insisting that he had spoken through his walkie-talkie, trying to contact me countless times. After a while, he had given up, so he went back to tell my parents. Although I was in a new part of the woods, I was able to successfully trace my way back. What confused me, though, was how we were both notably on the same channel, but I didn't hear a thing from him. And what confused me even more was the time that I had been out. I had no idea I was gone for that long. The time I'd been out there felt so brief. Eventually, we cleared everything up with the police. My friend and I had a talk with my parents about not going into the woods again without supervision. And that was that. Well, a week after that, Joe did tell me something no one else knew. He said he didn't want to tell my parents this because he was scared and he didn't want to get in trouble. Admittedly, he even had trouble bringing himself to tell me what he saw. Even though I never heard from him over the walkie-talkie, he claimed he saw someone who looked exactly like me. The figure's back was turned as Joe started running towards it. As he began to yell my name, whatever it was took an impossibly huge step away from him. Joe stopped dead in his tracks. Whoever it was then turned around to face him and slightly waved, a grin on their face. He claimed it was me. The only notable difference was my eyes. They were black. At that point, a feeling of dread washed over him. This figure that looked just like me stood there, staring at Joe. Joe ran as fast as he could back to my house, not looking back. He told me he didn't think he was chased or followed. When he got back to my house, he simply said I was lost and wouldn't pick up the walkie-talkie. He never mentioned anything else out of fear of what would happen if he did. To this day, we've kept that between ourselves. We've never told another soul. I still have no idea what happened that day, and I'm sharing this story in hopes that at least one person will have the slightest idea of what happened. It's difficult to live here. From Christopher P. I live in Southwest Oregon. Several years back, I was offered a living situation on 80 acres of forested land as a caretaker. This land is absolutely stunning. It was logged back in the 50s, but everything had grown back since, and fortunately, a few of the old legacy trees were spared. I've made hiking trails out of some of the old deer trails when the poison oak isn't too bad. At times, it seems like paradise, but there has come a sense of unease as well. To put it into perspective, I live in an old farm cabin that was built in the 1930s as part of some kind of goat farming outfit. A friend of mine, who is almost like a father to me, who has owned the property since the 60s, said the young man who used to live there was real sketchy. When he first moved into the house, before he built a new home elsewhere, all the house's windows were painted black, and there were a few other odd, off things about it. The house sits in a box canyon, one way in, one way out, with a neighbor across the street at the end of the half-mile driveway into the canyon. The canyon walls are very steep and heavily forested, with the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, public lands backing up to all the sides of the property's boundaries. There are really old, decrepit logging roads up on the BLM lands, but the 2 access points to these roads are heavily gated up and off limits. I've walked these old roads, as I've made some of my hiking trails up to them, and they're a good place to see wildlife. When I first moved onto the property, it seemed for months I would hear what sounded like metal banging behind my house up in the woods. The area it was coming from is heavily forested, and there's no houses up there for dozens of miles. Whatever it was, it didn't sound like an echo or something of that nature. It sounded real close. The friend of mine, the property owner, had said he had heard something similar throughout the years and would often contact BLM authorities to investigate. I'd also hear voices. I was home alone one day and heard people talking outside. My partner wasn't home, and so I called him and let him know what was up. I then went out with my bear mace and my jacket to see what was going on, but no one was out there. Just a cold day, though everything was oddly quiet. The neighbor would often tell us that she hears people's voices in the woods too, and yells out to them, but gets no replies, and she would ask if we were in the woods yelling that day, and we most certainly weren't. You also get the feeling of being watched. I know this is just a feeling and one could brush it off as paranoia, but it's a feeling so strong, like something or someone is watching you from the tree line. My dog also goes off at all hours in a tangent, and when I investigate, there's never anything there. A few times I've come home and he's running around loose. Someone let him out of his play area that I set up for him when I'm away, in town or something. I also seem to find odd things on my hikes up to the BLM lands. I once found what seemed like an old trash pit from the 70s or something with old car parts, springs from a mattress, and really old Coke cans. But there was also baby shoes and women's high heels. Something about it just made me cringe a little. This has all come to a head recently when a friend of the owner came to hunt the property for deer. He's an elderly Native American man who comes every year during the autumn months. He came back this time and said while he was hunting, he went up to the BLM land and stumbled across some bones. At first he assumed from a distance that they were some long-dead animal, until he got closer. He saw what appeared to be the bones of a human hand. He came down and told us of this, and then he contacted the authorities. Apparently, the authorities also think it's a human hand and are doing further investigation. The voices, the feelings, the metallic banging sounds, the items in the trash pile, the bones. It all doesn't sit right with me, and every evening when I'm walking the property to put my chickens away for the night, I get a real ugly feeling in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it can all be explained rationally, but it doesn't make me feel any better living here. A night hike I will never forget. From PX 5389. This took place about a year ago, back before I graduated high school. To give this story some background information, I'm from New York. I live in the Catskill region, so I have access to amazing hiking trails. There's many mountain ranges and hiking paths in this particular area alone that I enjoy going on. I live in a more suburban setting, while my friend lives in a more rural section of the county. My friend Ryan was lucky enough to have his house back right into the Catskill Nature Preserve. Since this story took place, he has moved. Fortunately, he still lives close to me. I think it's better he doesn't live there anymore anyway, after what happened. I recall the spectacular times when he had first moved into that house. There was a pool and jacuzzi on top of an amazing stone patio. Beyond the fence was a well-structured fire pit that was right next to a path, which leads to an outstanding hiking trail. The hiking trail then leads to a railroad, which, once crossed, allows you access to the steep mountain trail that we would hike so often with our friend group. His family really hit the jackpot when they bought this house, and the time that we've had this friend group, we've encountered many things while hiking, exploring, and doing random stuff outdoors. However, from all the bizarre experiences that we've encountered, we agreed in unison that this one was potentially the most life-threatening and scary. It came to the point where we stayed away from that trail for a solid 2 weeks. For us, that was a lot of time. We'd usually be hiking or exploring every other day. The afternoon that came prior to this night hike was a good one. I was hanging with Ryan and 2 other good friends, one of which had never been on a night hike with us. He was relatively new to our friend group, but fit right in. The only thing left was his so-called initiation into our group. We figured that the only way to test his true character was through challenging him to lead us up the mountain path that we had all become very well acquainted with behind Ryan's backyard. Only thing was that he had never been on it at night. Unlike the rest of us, he had only hiked it by day. It was his time to lead us up, his time to prove to us that he was as daringly adventurous as the rest of us. The afternoon went something along the lines of going for a drive into town and meeting up with a group of girls. After that, we all went back to Ryan's place, using his pool and jacuzzi. We took advantage of the fact that his parents had left town for a weekend getaway. We had the place to ourselves. However, we decided we weren't going to have a party tonight, so around 10, we had the girls leave. It was just us, the boys. We went beyond the gate of the backyard and started gathering some wood for a quick campfire before we made our trek up the mountain. Around 11, we went back inside the house to gather some supplies. You know, basic stuff like flashlights, pocket knives, and backpacks. After we had gathered our stuff, we made our way out onto the trail in his backyard. During the day, it was beautiful. After 5 minutes of being on the path, we would arrive at a spectacular field, which was full of tall grass, elevated from the path that you would naturally have just come off of, with a haze of sunlight and nature calling. However, it was dead out here right now. In the stillness of the dark, there was only the rustling of tall grass and the distant sounds of crickets. Although we felt somewhat on edge, knowing we were completely exposed, an unexplainable feeling of calmness had overtaken our beings. We walked across the grassland into the next part of the nature trail that led to the railroad. The moon shone brilliantly across the sky, acting as a secondary guide apart from our flashlights. It took some time, however, because there was a patch of brambles we all had to crawl through one by one. As we resumed our hike after clearing the brambles, we closed in on the hill that led to the top of the railroad tracks. This hill will be of key importance later in the story. Jagged rocks lined the elevation, so it was somewhat like rock climbing. We all managed to make it up and came upon the tracks. It was desolate. Something about being on the railroad tracks at night with no one else around was such an incredible feeling. I can't describe it in words, but basically, I felt no attachment to reality, and I was just in the moment. We just sat there on a few rocks, talking for a moment about life and our future exploration plans. Eventually, we carried on. Now we entered into the real hiking path that led all the way up the mountain. It was about 11:30 now. It typically took us half an hour to get up to the lookout point that we'd usually go to. And let me tell you, seeing the riverfront of the Hudson and the surrounding town's lights around it was truly breathtaking. I couldn't wait to see it once again. The darkness caused us no difficulty. We still were able to make it up in 30 minutes. We had gone on this trail with other people before, too. Normally, with your average person tagging along, the hike would usually take an hour. We, however, had become so well acquainted with the path that we basically knew where every darn rock was. There were no issues on the way up, apart from the subtle, typical paranoia of some kind of animal watching us. If there were any, though, we hadn't noticed. We made it to the top and enjoyed the view, and had some meaningful conversations. Around 12:30, we decided to head back down. In my opinion, coming down was always the best part. We literally ran down the mountain in an attempt to see who could get down to the railroad first. It took us around 20 minutes to get down. Like I said, we knew every part of the trail, and when it came to foot placement, we had absolutely no difficulty in avoiding rocks and tree branches coming down. This is the part where things become bizarre. I didn't mention it before, but when we'd come down the mountain, there was a fork in the trail. One part of the trail was longer while the other part was shorter. They both led back down and merged once again a few yards before you make it past the tree line and onto the tracks. This fork took place midway down the mountain. Usually on the way up, we would take the faster route for obvious reasons. On the way down, though, we had our newest official member of our group take the longer path down the mountain alone. It was sort of like a seal the deal kind of gesture. I look back to this day and wonder why in the world we told him to do that, and even more so why he agreed to do that. At that point, it was nothing really crazy to any of us. I guess that's only because we were so naive, and we'd never been exposed to anything critically unsafe. He'd be back down in 25 minutes, or so we thought, about 5 minutes after us. Once Ryan, my other friend, and I had gotten to the bottom of the mountain, we hid behind a big boulder, awaiting our other friend's arrival. Eventually, we heard twigs snapping, and we expected to see our friend coming out. By this point, the moon had been covered by some clouds, so we were not able to make out the key details of the figure. But what we saw come out did not match the stature or physique of our friend. It was skinny and malnourished looking. It was shorter. Its arms came down much further than a human's, at least any human I'd ever seen, which only baffled me more. I could not make out any distinguishing features of its head or face. We sat there just looking, not sure what to make of the situation. All of us in our minds could not stop thinking of our poor friend who was still alone out there. The guilt and anxiety that rushed through my body alone was enough to make me almost throw up. Whatever it was, it paused for a moment. Then, thankfully, walked the opposite way on the railroad away from us. It had made it around a quarter-mile away when we heard more branches snap by the tree line. At this point, we didn't know what to expect. My stomach dropped. Then my friend began calling our names. The last thing I wanted to do was make our presence known to whatever that thing was, though. I panicked. Our plan on pranking my friend had gone south. I gave one last glance into the distance and saw whatever it was continuing to walk in its own direction, down the railroad, not even flinching. I found this odd, that it had just paid no attention to my friend. We all came out and whispered to him to quiet down. We asked if he saw anything or heard anything, but he said no. He looked so confused and began to laugh. He said, "If you guys are trying to prank me, it's not going to work. The hike was fine. I don't know why y'all are still screwing with me. After all, I was the one who had to go at it alone." As he said that, I glanced back at where the figure had been walking and didn't see it. It was impossible for it to have disappeared, unless it had gone back past the tree line. We all stood silent for a moment. I finally spoke for the group. Listen, all you need to know is that we need to get back to Ryan's house right now. I was raising my voice at this point out of fear and insistence. Our friend was so lost, and I know if he had experienced something surreal, he would have told us. I told everyone to hurry up, that we're gonna run. Whatever it was, we had lost all sight of it and had no idea where it turned. We climbed down the rocky hill onto the path as quick as we could, sliding on the way down. We eventually made it back to the grassland, getting closer to Ryan's house. We started to walk, as we felt we were a safe distance away from that thing. As we walked across the field, we heard a screeching sound. My whole body shivered. I stood there, as did everyone else. We all just looked at each other. Goosebumps infested my arms. I started to shiver uncontrollably. We heard it again. It was distant, coming from the direction of the train tracks. The second time was the last time we heard it. It was every man for himself now. We scattered. It took us a few minutes to get back, but we made it, all of us. We sat there for 15 minutes discussing what the heck happened. All of us were in shock. I know at this point in the story things looked bad, but it only got worse from there. As Ryan went inside to get his pistol in case anything came into the backyard, we all sat there in silence. A moment later, he came back in a panic. "Guys, have you seen my phone?" My heart sank. We all said no, and after calling it many times with no success of hearing it, we were forced to accept the fact it was gone. Ryan was mad. He was cursing under his breath and throwing stuff. We sat there just watching him, our minds still in shock. He took the magazine in his pocket, put it in the pistol and loaded it, and that got our attention. Then he said, "I need that phone. I can't afford to lose it. I sure as heck can't leave it out there. If my parents call to check in right now, I'll be screwed." It was 1 a.m. We were all uneasy and didn't exactly want to go back in there after what we saw. We eventually agreed to accompany Ryan to the entrance of the field, but no further. We had gotten to the point of the trail with no luck. He was insistent on pressing forward, but all of us said, "You're crazy." Ryan replied, "Fine, I'll go in. But you're going to keep calling the cell phone until I can hear it, okay?" We agreed. We used my phone. As we called, the purest form of dread washed over me. Every time I heard the phone ring, I thought someone would pick up, and it wouldn't be Ryan. After 15 slow, agonizing minutes, the phone picked up all of a sudden, making us all jump. He said he got it, and we asked where he found it. Apparently, it was at the bottom of the rocky hill that led to the tracks. The fact that he was that far made me concerned. What if that person or creature was still out there? As we continued to talk, he abruptly stated he needed to go. Before I could say anything else, he hung up. We sat there in isolation, waiting and dreading what was going to happen next. We were past the point of pranks. Whatever happened now was serious. I tried calling him back 3 times, but it went straight to voicemail. I figured this couldn't be a good sign, and he had either turned off his phone or put it on Do Not Disturb mode, for whatever reason. A few more minutes passed, and we suddenly got a text from him. It said, "Get back to the house. Not safe. I'm there. I took another way." As we read that, we suddenly felt like we were being watched. That feeling you get when you're in the open and something might be lurking nearby. We were a few minutes from home, but in that time period, whatever the heck was out there could be watching us for all I knew. We took off back to the house, and at one point my friend had tripped. Me and another friend ran back to help him, and we continued going all together. We eventually made it back, and Ryan was waiting for us. He yelled out, "Guys, get out of there! Now!" We ran to him. He explained everything. He said he had been jogging through the woods and eventually heard a distinct buzzing sound, which he realized was his phone. It was right at the edge of the bottom of the rocky hill leading to the tracks. He says it must have fallen out of his pocket as he was sliding down the dang hill. He cautiously started walking. When in reach, he picked up his phone. After standing there for a few minutes, distracted on a call with us to let us know that he'd found the phone, he heard something walking on top of the tracks, rocks crunching under the weight of something. That's when he hung up in fear of whatever he was hearing. He kept walking at that constant pace onward, continuing to hear the sounds, which he claimed sounded bipedal, based on the amount of time it took for one foot to sink into the crunching rocks after the other. He couldn't see over the hill onto the train tracks, making it impossible to figure out what it was. He ran back urgently, and only when he got back home he decided to text us. I thought this was kind of dumb to leave us hanging like that, but hey, we do stupid things when we're scared. We sat there just thinking what to do. We were quiet for a while, just listening to every sound and looking into the tree line, anticipating something to happen. Eventually, we heard rustling coming from the woods. Ryan, scared out of his mind, shot off around into the woods. Whatever was in there ran away. I'm pretty sure it was just a deer, though. Or at least, I hope it was. Nothing else happened that night. We locked the doors, turned out the lights, and hung out in the living room. There was no chance we were actually falling asleep. The unreal experience we had would haunt us for a long time. As freakish as it was, I'm oddly happy to know I have a surreal story to tell anyone who I'm close to. What matters is that my friends and I made it out okay. Looking back, I know that screeching sound could have been a screech owl or fox. But knowing that someone or something else was out there that barely looked human at all made me question that. None of us were on any substances. We were completely sober. And I know what we saw was real. I know that there are things out there that come out at night and hide during the day. And I now know that there are some things that never want to be discovered. To this day, I have no idea what the creature was or what its intentions were. I don't know if it had followed my two friends and I or my other friend down that long path. Quite frankly, I don't want to know. Some say ignorance is bliss, and I wholeheartedly agree.